Canada post the pandemic. Welcome to No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Yes, that's me. The budget, the first in 2 years, at more than 700 pages in length, is definitely an election budget with more than $100 billion in promised new spending. It is a chicken in every pot. But is that the right thing to do at this time? Kevin Page, the former Parliamentary Budget Officer and now the head of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa, joins us now. This is an incredibly busy week. The budget, the Bank of Canada releases a lot of its data, consumer price index, so much to get over today. Thanks so much, Kevin, for being with us.
Great to be with you, Senator.
I want to start with this budget, which almost everybody is calling an election document, as opposed to a pandemic budget document. And I just wanted the chapter titles when you go through this big document: New Opportunities for Canadians, A Healthy Environment for a Healthy Economy, Strengthening Cities and Communities We Call Home, A More Equal Canada, Strong Indigenous Communities, Protecting Our Shared Values. This seems to be more about messaging than economics.
Yeah, it's a lot of messaging and it's a lot of priorities. I think, as you go through them, I think you get to 10 priorities. And as you start to go chapter by chapter, I counted them. I think, Senator, there's well in excess of 250 line item adjustments to spending. So it's distinctive in that way as a budget.
So how are we to make sense of this? I guess we should start with where we're at. The signals from the Bank of Canada, interest rates are holding, but may have to go up sooner. A hot housing market. There's certainly some inflation out there. Everything is more expensive. The Bank of Canada guardedly optimistic. Is this the right time for $100 billion in spending?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we could debate it, and I think we won't know. I think until we get much further into the year, and maybe even early into next year, to really get a better sense as to how the recovery is going to proceed. There's definitely different scenarios, but it's an action-packed week when you get an historic budget, and a release from our governor of the Bank of Canada, Mr. Macklem, and you get inflation news as well, which is kind of considered to be a longer term risk.
So how are we to judge this then in the short term? I think you're quite right. We won't know till we see what happens. We won't know if this third wave is going to be contained by vaccines or not. So we just have to live through it.
Yeah, so there's definitely, this is, again, a difficult environment, I think, to release a budget. The pandemic is not over, as you alluded to. That third wave, particularly in Ontario, where I am at today, is a major issue, big lockdowns, which have enormous economic impact for the economy. The data that we have now with respect to output and jobs, indicates that, we're still climbing out of a hole that we dug, in early in 2020 because of the shutdown related to the pandemic. And I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. You want to be optimistic that with vaccines, the pandemic, for the most part disappears, and that the recovery will be strong in the second half. But it's an enormous process to roll out a vaccine, the vaccination process. It's And global uncertainty, and because this really is a global issue, that there's just a lot of unknowns. And so you have a budget, and there was a strategy, which I'm sure we're going to talk about.
Okay, so we're seeing in the U.S., and a lot of people have been critical of the new president for his massive spending programs. We benefit, of course, enormously from economic activity and growth and recovery in the U.S. Just in general, I guess, as a theory, should we be waiting to see how that plays out before we engage in this. This is not recovery spending, or this is not dealing with COVID. These are whole new social programs and a whole new way government is approaching its relations with the provinces and with Canadians.
Yeah, so I heard, recently, I think it was Mr. Sakaria said on his show on the weekend that I think he was quoting a French prime minister that said governing is about making choices. And I think the government definitely made choices, and their choices where we need to act now, that we need to act broadly. So we can't focus just on one priority or two priorities. And that we're, because we're in this crisis, so we can't waste too much time. So I think for like President Biden, this, as you signaled, those are enormous amounts of monies that he's putting into the economy, and the U.S. didn't, decline as much as Canada in 2020, and they're expected to have a much stronger 2021. And it, certainly with all that stimulus, monetary and fiscal stimulus, I think the U.S. outlook could be, quite strong. I mean, Europe is also like they're moving ahead with stimulus. So like, the question about spending a $100 billion stimulus package over the next 3 years, I think that's that $100 billion, if that's what it turns out to be over the next 2 years, is probably in line with many European countries and the kind of recommendations coming out of Brussels and the EU. So they made a choice. Like there is another strategy, potentially different electoral cycle. Maybe the government says, no, we will wait. We don't have to move really quickly. We'll just focus on this pandemic, and when the clouds clear. But I think there was a lot of anxiety that they needed to go quickly, but the potential for this election coming in the fall.
Okay, so when you say choices, some of them are interesting. They've been talking about a guaranteed annual income. They've been talking about pharmacare, but in fact, they chose childcare. Now, that fits into the idea that that the pandemic has caused a she-cession, that women have been unduly impacted because they've got the double duties of working and childcare. And this is a massive spending program, but it requires 50-50 funding from provinces, most of which are almost bankrupt from dealing with the COVID situation. So they can't take this up.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a difficult context, as we know from past efforts to kind of launch a childcare program, an early learning program for children, and something that is really national in nature. It has to be negotiated.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think this strategy seems to be we're gonna put the money up, and we're going to let people know that the government's going to spend this money. That you're right, the government picked this as their number one priority. It wasn't increasing the Canada Health Transfer. It wasn't strengthening the social safety net. It wasn't even putting more money, for that matter, into climate change adjustment. So this is the priority. It's going to be negotiated. I think it's hard to predict now what this ultimate program will look like. Will it be a transfer, and will there be conditions around the transfer? How do we deal with Quebec that is, already well ahead of other provinces in terms of modeling this program out? So it's going to be negotiated. It's going to take many months, and in this environment when the fiscal strings are tight for provinces, it gets that much more complicated.
The other concern about this program is that it's very urban based as opposed to rural. I mean, this is putting money into daycare operations, into centers, where in most smaller communities, you're going to depend on the neighbor down the road and pay her to look after your child. You know her, but there's also no other option. So should the money be going to parents rather than daycare centers or childcare centers?
Yeah, so I mean that could still we could end up with a program design that that's not really even being discussed right now. There was probably an option, like we could use the tax system or a direct spending program to citizens in order to make sure that families have the funds for childcare. We could take a very infrastructure approach to make sure that monies are being spent, that we have those spaces for children, not just in urban areas, but the rural areas as well. There's a big dimension in the First Nations area, which is in many cases certainly is more rural related, that like how are we going to deal with those sorts of needs? There's some money in the budget for infrastructure, how it gets allocated. We have a 736 page document, but again, we can kind of, as we start poking around, we realize that, we could have made the document even bigger if we went further. But I don't think the government said we got money, let's negotiate. And so there's a lot of excitement. I think premiers are going to be under pressure to move forward on a program
for sure. But that is the question when you say it, and this is what everybody is. How everybody's operating right now. The Bank of Canada is buying up government debt. This week, the bank purchased nearly $5 billion worth of Government of Canada bonds. And if you look at the straight line from March of 2020, from $76 billion in purchases to $360 billion in purchases, we're printing money. So do we really have money?
Well, I mean, I think it's. I think just what you've alluded to, the use of by central banks, not just in Canada but really around the world, to soak up government debt instruments. I think, again, we've never, at least I think in my lifetime, I mean, not even after the 2009 global financial crisis did we see central banks this involved, with respect to the expansion of their balance sheets, buying government debt. So, do we have the money? Do we have the resources? I think we know that there's a lot of debt that has been built up even since the 2009 financial crisis. You could see, you can use Statistics Canada data. We see significant increases in household debt, in financial debt, non-financial corporation debt, and of course, government debt. So we've been financing a lot of this growth, I think, over the past decade through debt. And a lot of it has been more consumption related. So these are kind of this debt, we're using it to buy goods that are not, that we're consuming as we speak. We're not, we haven't done a lot of investment. Again, those investment numbers, public and private, have been very flat, for many years in real terms. So, yeah, so I mean, it's a strategy. I was reading recently, Mr. Macklin, the governor of the Bank of Canada, says I think the strategy is that you want to overwhelm the crisis. And I thought it was an interesting way of framing it. And so, again, there was, major concerns that this pandemic could have turned into a more serious recession, potentially a depression, if there wasn't significant fiscal supports. So, I mean, I think, the governor of the Bank of Canada thinks that, that this is a policy. It's not sustainable forever, but over the short term it is. And the government feels that it has the fiscal space in order to do this, in part thanks to those low interest rates, but also our net debt, relative to income, relative to other countries, it still remains it gives the sense that we have that kind of space. Some other countries don't have that space. A lot of developing economies, some Southern European economies, they would have to kind of look, hope for support from other countries, and then they ride their waves.
But is that argument that we hear all the time, and we're seeing it happen in the housing sector? Obviously, when interest rates are low, it's an incentive to go and buy. That leads to a hot market. But just because interest rates are low, can we really just spend? Or must this be at the very least a short-term strategy, not how we operate, this kind of modern monetary theory, which is let's just spend our way through whatever the crisis of day is. Today, it might be COVID. Tomorrow, it may be another fall on the stock market. We just don't know.
Yeah, so I think there is a concern by some that just with the stimulus coming from governments and from banks, that they're, the message that I think people like with respect to this modern monetary theory is that our central authorities are just going to do whatever it takes until inflation comes back. And we haven't seen much inflation, over the past few decades. It's not been a major concern. We've had a couple of significant economic shocks, global shocks, and then so that they will use, their fiscal capacities, monetary capacities to kind of help spend our way out of this. Until inflation comes back. And I think it can come back. I mean, I started at the Department of Finance in kind of that 1980 period, worked on the early budgets in the early 80s. And I was actually first job was an inflation analyst. And so I remember those numbers quite well. Double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment. And different demographics, different economy, but it's not impossible with all this stimulus that we could see We certainly see a spike in inflation, including later this year, if, we're successful vaccinating and there's just all this money in the system that it could drive prices up, and there could be some significant supply constraints with a lot of surge in demand. And you'll see prices spike. And there's probably some lessons learned in the housing market. And again, if you work your way through those numbers, some of it is low interest rates. Big part of it is low interest rates, but also not a lot of demand, not of supply rather in the resale market because we're not moving around. But you see that, those price pressures are deep. Like they go right into, the products to build homes. They're into the forest industry now. So again, if you're an inflation analyst, you look to see like, how is it going to spill over? But I think the one thing people will really look for, could this translate to a significant increases in wages? Some increases in wages would be good, but the inflation people will probably say until we get really significant wage pressure in particular, where the cost of production is pushing up prices, and it really has to come from wages, then inflation is probably not going to get out of control, not going to get out of that 1 to 3% range that Governor Macklin is concerned about.
Speaking of wages, what about a federal $15 minimum wage?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that $15 is it a right amount? We could discuss that. Like in the context of just the federal sector, how many people are actually making less than $15? Like, is there really, or is this more of a symbolic measure saying, we have an income disparity problem in this country. We know we need redistribution. We need just, if minimum wage could be part of a broader package to help people, with lower incomes. I don't know how you survive with less than $15, and I'm sure there are a lot of people doing 2-3 jobs. And so, yeah.
Well, it also, again, depends on where you live. Like $15 an hour in Toronto is impossible to even contemplate, but $15 an hour in a small town in Saskatchewan is not that bad.
Yeah, you're right. Cost of living is a big part of it. And there are definitely big differentials between those big cities and the smaller towns where we came from.
So this is going to put a lot of pressure on private sector employers. Is that the intent, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really a symbolic move of 15, the announcement by the government on the minimum wage of $15. And, we've seen premiers in the country talk about this, and we've seen significant reactions from certain sectors. My wife is a small business bookkeeper, so she knows it can really squeeze their profit margins for a lot of service industries. It's an adjustment.
Do you see, because some things are starting to be written now in the days after the budget about this is a jurisdictional push by the federal government as well. We saw their win on the carbon tax, and a lot of the provinces have said that's interference on the provincial level. There's been lots of fights through the COVID debate about whose jurisdiction is what. They're on the delivery end. Ottawa's on the provisional end, providing. The daycare issue, again, the childcare issue. Is this, are we seeing that whole discussion in this country really open again?
Yes, I think we are. I think, and I probably have to go back to kind of, the 80s, 90s, late 80s, early 90s, when we were talking about those, various accords, Meach or Charlottetown, changing major transfers in a significant way, these transfers for health and post-secondary education and social assistance. That I think just the agenda itself, that I think part of the government's getting pushed to address, which, around climate, which is, again, crosses borders. How are we going to deal with those issues? Can we work together? Around some of these broader health issues, certainly the pandemic, our ability to respond to the next pandemic or something similar, again, requires enormous work together. And I think even in this budget, there was some spending on infrastructure. There was a call for a national needs assessment. And that, again, means that we're, again, from our political masters or leaders, that we're going to have to find ways to really strengthen, that governance between different levels of government, including First Nations, because this agenda just sort of drives you that way. And if the feds announce these programs, but they don't really want to do the hard work, And if they're not prepared to compromise, because premiers will say, I prefer to have money for the Canada Health transfer, I need a break or somewhere else. We're going to need that type of leadership and the willingness to have those negotiations. And I remember being in central agencies in the late 80s, early 90s. It seemed like almost every week we're having a first minister's meeting. And, we could see those times again as we start negotiating new accords for things like childcare or climate. I think we're just at the front end of this discussion.
Well, and the money is weighted. I guess that's why I keep asking about this spending on the federal side, that of course it has its political import. If you can announce a childcare program, it doesn't actually matter if 5 years down the road you still haven't accomplished it. You get to announce it and take the benefit from all of that. But it seems to me that provinces are going to be in fiscal trouble for much longer than Ottawa. The Bank of Canada is buying up some of their debt too, but not at the same rate, nor do they have the ability to pay back.
Yeah, so I think we have, the provinces are very big players in our federation fiscally. Like if you add up all the revenues and spending of provinces, it's bigger than the federal government. Our transfer system is very significant. Pre-COVID, we were probably, program spending, budgetary expenditures rather in the $350 billion range. We were transferring, in the $60 to $70 billion range for health and for equalization and social support. So, those programs, they could be up for grabs. I think we have a fiscal imbalance between the federal government and the provincial government. I think we've seen those numbers, certainly from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, from the International Monetary Fund, people that do this sort of long-term fiscal sustainability work. So there's a need that we're going to have to tackle, like these sorts of big programs. I don't know that there's a huge appetite to deal with it right in this environment, minority parliament, pandemic crisis. We can go on. Like cities, do they really have the revenues that they need to deal with the future? Probably not. We've had royal commissions, I think in the 80s, that kind of looked at these big issues, brought the evidence to bear, and really pushed the politicians to make these decisions. And I think on childcare, just to circle back, I think there's a lot of support, I think, for this program, not just amongst academics, but people and young people that realize how important this is. And they're going to put pressure on politicians to do this one. And I remember there's a quote from FDR, Mr. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. He said, "I want to do it. Now make me do it." And so I think that people are going to make me do it. They're going to put a lot of pressure. We want this program.
Well, and I think COVID has created the circumstance in the sense of everybody trying to work at home with 2 or 3 kids underfoot. The reality has become pretty stark. Yeah, I actually even watched it. I was very fortunate that my daughter-in-law and son had a grandchild, but the issue of childcare. So they're just 3 months to the road. But we lived it when I was, when we raised our family. When we got to 3 children, my wife stayed home and ran a daycare. And my daughter, who kind of, was in part of that environment, who she wants to run a daycare. She says she just loved the warmth and the experiences you get from having children in your home, which we've experienced. It's hard to put a dollar figure on that, even though dollars are important if we want more women in the labor force. Yeah, that's a really interesting point that and that means the provinces are going to have to make some tough calls if the political pressure is on them, and it's coming from Ottawa as well. When we talk about these big programs and kind of renegotiating the grand Canadian bargain here, I guess we have to put equalization on the table.
Yeah, I think we do. And I think that's even in these sorts of conversations that we're having now, what would be a funding arrangement for childcare when Quebec already has this program. So how would they be compensated? So again, that's another way of looking at equalization outside of the equalization program. But I think the federal transfers are up for grabs. I think the premiers were right to say that if we have a Canada Health Act, then they would expect that, the federal government brings their spending power to bear. And they weren't wrong to suggest that, 35 cents in every dollar, which, could be a minimum that we could work to. I think that's, again, we will need to kind of really, I don't think the Prime Minister's going to have a choice. He's going to have to deal with the Canada Health transfer at some point in time.
Yeah, and I think that's what the provinces will be pushing back with, which is all well and good that you came up with this program, but what we're in the middle of, because it has exposed that flaw, not only in seniors' residences in old folks' homes, but just in basic preparation. We're sending sick people home so that we can deal with other sick people in the course of COVID. That doesn't seem like a reasonable thing in a G7 country in 2021.
No, it was hard to watch. I think we're, particularly, with respect to long-term care. And yeah, I think, it would be a shame if we work our way through this pandemic and we don't, kind of look at what are all those lessons learned and, maybe an independent assessment. So we take some of the politics out of it. And we look at our healthcare system in a very serious way. And what adjustments do we need to make? And then I think at some point, financial people will have to make sure that, we have the appropriate fiscal arrangements between different levels of government, to make sure that we can bring that about.
When you talk about lessons learned, and I guess this is one of my issues right now, is how will we be able, do you think, will we be allowed, can we find a structure that will really do an assessment of what went wrong? I mean, the trouble is we're in pre-election mode already, but can we have some kind of assessment of what went wrong and why, so that we do have those lessons learned? And can we somehow depoliticize it? I don't see how. Do you?
Yeah, I think it would. Again, maybe this is a question where people people rise up and we just demand it. Like, we want that independent assessment. We don't want to go through this again. And so one of my colleagues sent me just a little, kind of funny YouTube video where there's a sheep that got stuck in kind of a little bit of a trench in a farmer's yard. And then somebody, a young child pulls it out and the sheep runs down another 20, 30 feet and then jumps back into the trench again and stuck in it again. And you kind of feel it somehow. If we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves in it. And I think Canadians, you can see the frustration. People in Ontario, we've had a lot of stops and starts with respect to social distancing and just the COVID restrictions. That, like, we want it. If we go through this again, we want to be better ready with respect to the equipment, with respect to long-term care, with respect to health, with respect to those fiscal and social supports, so that we don't. We just have to learn all these lessons. So I think we need an independent, some independent work and analysis. And I'm sure the government could have announced. It would have been nice if they would have announced it as part of their budget package.
Exactly. And somebody noted that along the way, which is, where was the lessons learned, the budget allotment for that, so that there'd be some assurance that we're going to do it.
Yeah, that was a disappointment.
Yeah. You spent most of your, of course, working in adult life as a civil servant in finance, Treasury Board, Privy Council, agri-food, the whole 9 yards, before you became Parliamentary Budget Officer. And it was your job, and there is a current incumbent, of course, whose job it still is, to ensure some accountability, because government is spending other people's money. Does it work, the process?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. It doesn't work. It's even when I was the Parliamentary Budget Officer, I found myself in front of committees, Operations and Estimates Committee, in front of Pat Martin, who was chairing that committee. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about, how do we reform the system? And I think the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, I think was a reform, was to make sure that parliamentarians, people in the House and the Senate, had access to financial, expertise, independent expertise that they could use in order to help, hold the government to account. And I think that was a positive development, but I still think fundamentally that our system, the way we approve these authorities, is broken. And I think you started the segment by saying, who could read these budgets, all these priorities? Is it a readable document? But I think once you go deeper, even how do we approve legislation, spending legislation, the supply process? People cannot follow the numbers from the budgets to the estimates process. These supply bills. They get lost in these massive omnibus bills, which I'm sure if we have a budget omnibus bill, is going to be enormous for this particular budget. And so it's just, it's incomprehensible for most people, for actually almost everybody. And I think so. I worry that, we don't have the ability to really, to communicate, to people what is in these budgets, what's really at stake, because they're not readable, and senators and people at the House cannot follow the money. It's these documents are either completely disconnected.
You cannot follow the money. And I know it from the Senate process. In the old days as a journalist, you spent 7 or 8 hours in a lockup, and there were experts there, and experts that you brought in from your own news organization, and people worked through it. And then you spent the next, however many weeks or months finding all the little details. But now, and particularly in COVID, we have been restricted in the Senate. Spending estimates come in, but we can only sit for a day because people can't travel and there's not enough technology to keep the Senate up and running. And so there's kind of just a truncated approval process. You don't know what's in there if you're not on the committee. How on earth could Canadians figure it out?
Yeah, and I don't think almost every day, including this week, I get calls from members of Parliament. Can you explain this to me? And it's a struggle. I think when I was in, this is a very unusual lockup. People were like myself would be attached to one media outlet, and we would be like locked in a room. I was, with an organization you're familiar with, CTV. Yeah. And I spent the day, with these, good folks in a very unusual environment. But so people like me will read these documents in a very different way than I think, an average citizen, I would presume, would start at page 1 and try to work their way through. You said it's a 736 page document. Yeah. I think I checked, like War and Peace, Mr. Tolstoy's book was 1,200 pages, first edition. No one's going to read that document in one day. And no. you can't, and then you get lost through it. But then even what's important often gets buried in the annexes. Budgets are fiscal plans. All the fiscal numbers are buried in the annex. Yeah. Somebody like me will look at these tables. I'll look at the economic outlook table and I'll see, well, the government's really revised up its forecast. And I can tell you exactly how much the size of the economy has gotten bigger since the fall. And then immediately somebody like me will say, well, okay, so they have more resources now than what they told Canadians with respect to their budgetary track in the fall. So within a few calculations, somebody like me or all my colleagues would basically be able to say that roughly 75% of the $140 billion worth of spending over the 6-year period is funded from a forecast adjustment. So when the government said
we think things are going to get better, so therefore we can spend this much money. Exactly.
They spend it. And yet I would say that has been a bit of a pattern for the Liberal government since 2015. That when they had what some economists would call a positive economic surprise, the outlook looks a little bit better. Again, in the context of really no fiscal anchor, a weak fiscal anchor, declining debt to GDP ratio, they said, well, we got more room to renew, let's spend it. And so the government revised the forecast in this very uncertain environment, much stronger growth projected now, 2021 and 2022, and they spent it. And again, it brought enormous amounts of revenues. It effectively funded this, this very large spending package, 75% of it anyways, and the rest of it.
By just saying, we think things are going to get better.
Yeah, it's just an assumption, right? And again, who can predict the future?
This question, you've used the word and it's kicked around a lot now, fiscal anchor. And even in the wake of this, the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, said, well, this is a spending plan. We don't need an anchor as such because we've set out a plan. And but everybody else in the world of economics says, no, there has to be some reference point. Your debt to GDP ratio, how much debt you have versus everything generated by the economy, that's got to somehow stay in line. Or pick another one, like David Dodge and others have said, tie it to the cost of your debt. Find a new, it doesn't matter what it is, just tie it to something so we have a reference point.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, economists will look at governments and they'll raise concerns of something called like a deficit bias. It's just a lot easier than for our political leaders to kind of increase spending but not increase taxes. And we didn't really see much in the way of revenue generation in this budget over the medium term. So yeah, I think we want governments to feel that there's constraints, that they're leaving fiscal space for future generations for to deal with these other big issues that we're going to have to deal with.
Or another crisis, who knows, right?
As there will be, as we saw in 2009, and here we are, 10 years later in another crisis. And I think we want a fiscal anchor. I think when Minister Phelan says that the real anchor in this spending budget is really, these outcomes that we're going to try to obtain 5 years from now in 2025, 26, you would have to be quite specific. Like you can walk down for every single program that we've, and there's like 250 spending announcements in this budget, including childcare. Where exactly are we going to be in 2025, 26 with respect to childcare spaces and, and the cost of those spaces? There's none of that. They don't constrain themselves in that way. So if we don't have that, then we need these fiscal constraints. And yes, they could be, with respect to debt and debt relative to the economy, respect to the budgetary balance, which Finance Minister Paul Martin used through the late 1990s, early 2000s. We can get innovative and look at the carrying cost of debt, like former Governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge, one of my former bosses at Department of Finance, would use. There's a range of things. I thought the government was quite innovative when they talk about using fiscal guardrails with respect to stimulus. But what we saw in this budget is that they didn't use them. There was no guard to the rail. They just basically said, we have a weak labor market. So we're going to, we said we'd spend up to $100 billion. We're going to spend $100 billion and let's move on. 736-page document, but probably one paragraph on the fiscal anchor and one text box on fiscal guardrails.
Yeah, that's the concerning thing. You talk about outcomes, and that's we kind of have two levels of this, because of course you ultimately say on the federal stage, which is if people don't like the outcomes or if there aren't any, then your choice is just to defeat that government, move on and pick another one. So that's always a difficult one, but outcomes just in terms of programs. I was just looking at someone from the Public Health Agency, the people that have been managing COVID, appearing before committee. And he was asked, with all of the disasters that we've seen unfold throughout COVID here, was anybody held accountable? Did anybody get fired for not having PPE available or sending it off to the dump? Or, we've got in the infrastructure department, you've got a 70% fail rate of projects. Who's accountable? How do we judge outcomes? And is anybody accountable if they're not the ones that are good or right for the country?
Yeah, so I think we've, for a number of decades now, we've talked about performance budgeting and performance accountability, and I think governments around the world have struggled with it. I know the OECD is trying to encourage governments to be more performance related, and I think we do need that kind of transparency. And I think when we have this sort of transparency, including a number of the issues that you've raised with respect to equipment that we need to make sure that we can deal with virus spread, or our capacity to produce vaccines, that we need just that level of transparency so we can at least have the conversations. Are we ready? But I think, there's a lot of people, a lot of us, probably including myself, we're guilty of kind of a willful blindness, perhaps, that we don't want to think this is going to happen. And I think we got caught, and with respect to this pandemic, that we were not ready for it. And clearly we were not ready. And and like potentially the military, when they're doing operations, they'll test these systems, or we often, our financial people will stress test banks to see if you have a crisis, do you have enough, do you have those capital buffers to deal with it? We're not stress testing our healthcare system. And we know we're dealing with a massive challenge with respect to climate change. And are we, really you can't really say that, we had a budget. I think they claimed that we have a plan for climate, but I don't think Canadians see the plan for climate. We don't see the plan for kind of a more comprehensive social safety net. And so, I mean, like, there's still a lot of work to do. And even though that was a pretty big budget with a lot of priorities and, and some significant down payments, but we're a long ways away from really solving some of those bigger issues.
You've written about this. I think your book was, if I've got it correct, Unaccountable Truth and Lies on Parliament Hill. Is that close to the the title?
Yeah, the title we wanted to call it was, The Cost of Indifference. But so
yes,
the book, that it's just like an op-ed, like it'll be the publishing company will decide what the title is.
Right. Yeah, I know that one.
Unaccountable.
The debate that goes on Parliament Hill is kind of mindlessly partisan, and it doesn't matter who's in power and who's in opposition. It kind of gets relegated to that category. Analysis is even more lacking than debate, and I guess they're two related products. What tells me about this situation that government has seemed, as you say, ill-prepared, and government at all levels, ill-prepared, not able to turn on a dime, giving conflicting, contradictory advice. Do this, do that, wear a mask, don't. We ordered vaccines. Oh, we got the wrong one. On and on it goes. That at the end of this, there's going to even be less confidence in governance and government structures and leadership, that this has kind of proved that nobody's very good at the job.
Yeah, it's hard to point to too many countries that would say that we're happy with they're happy with their response,
correct,
particularly when you're losing lives and you're shutting down economies over multiple times. So. Yeah, we want to do better the next time. We weren't ready. We kind of learning on the fly on a lot of these issues. And I think to your point about debate around this stuff, I really believe that the precondition of that debate is to have really good analysis and evidence and information. Like, I think as somebody that was, a public servant for decades, that I think that I think we're totally comfortable as a public servant to see politics and in its full partisan nature. Like, I think we don't necessarily, I don't personally want to change that, but I think as somebody that was like a parliamentary budget officer as well, that we just want to make sure that there's the information. So when they are debating, there is this evidence. So if we're having this independent commission, let's pull together as many experts as we can, bring together the information, the analysis, the postmortems, and then, give it to our political leaders so that they can make decisions. That there's you're going to naturally be some politics around it, then we're okay with that.
But you're also concerned that not just Canadians are indifferent, and that would be sort of on a good day, because lots of days they're angry, but the civil service, those that provide that basic information, and sometimes they're educating ministers too, not just Canadian public, that they've kind of become indifferent, saying, look, this is all going to be about politics any way you look at it. And it doesn't matter whether we put out the just right in the Goldilocks proposal, too hot, too cold, and one that's just right. The politicians are going to do what they think will get them more votes, never mind whether it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think that for me, I worry about the lack of evidence and analysis kind of going forward in terms of how we deal with these big forward-looking issues. Making our economies more resilient, dealing, the next pandemic, dealing with the inclusion issue, reducing these big income disparities, dealing with climate change. But, I think there's going to be. I think looking back, I think what I saw, and I got the chance to talk to some of my colleagues who are senior public servants. I saw and some and the premiers as well, the public health officials. I saw enormous strain that people that were getting to their breaking point, because they knew that there were lives were on the line, economies were on the line, and there's. So I guess I'm a bit of two minds. We want to do better the next time. I think we just need to learn all that we can, that what we passed through. And I think, I have probably some appreciation just because I saw the stress. A lot of these public servants are working it's probably hard for some people to believe, but some of these people do. They work like every day of the week and long hours.
Yeah.
And, I think in many cases they did their best, but we were just not ready. So how do we get ready so we can see, we can go through the next exercise that much better? But I think there's probably lessons there directly related to climate change and another, Mother Nature crisis that's looming, playing out in front of us.
So what is your takeaway as we wrap this discussion up today? How should people be viewing where we're at, that it's possible that a recovery is underway? We don't know if the third wave is going to set us back on our heels, that the spending is large, but we can handle it in the short term. Certainly we will learn lessons from COVID and never do it again. Like, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I would say that with respect to the recovery, that we're still trying to get to the starting line. So if this was like we were running a race, some 10-kilometer race or marathon, like we've been running backwards, and we're still not even at the starting line to get going. So the recovery is still in front of us, and I think but I think that if we can. This whole issue of the strength of recovery and how fast we get to the starting line really does depend on this public health issue. Can we vaccinate people? Will the vaccinations be successful against these variants? And again, it's a Canadian issue, but it's also a global issue. Like on the longer term issues, yeah, it's possible we could have an election. And I hope that we need all political parties bring great ideas, well-researched ideas just about like what is the post-COVID economy going to look like? What is the role of government? What's the role of private sector? I think they could bring their politics, bring their ideologies, but also let's bring evidence. And yeah, so people are going to be watching. Like we're watching, will the Conservative Party have a good climate change plan? And will the NDP? Will they? Yes, there's people out there that want pharmacare. They want a more inclusive country with better social safety nets. But how will we pay for that? What's the tax plan? And is it reasonable? Like, are they going to bring the evidence to play there with respect to tax reforms? So yeah, I think there's an opportunity coming. I think the next election will be important. I agree with you. This budget does look like an election budget. There's just so much in it, and it's not like a budget. I think you might get, if you had a majority government in the middle of a mandate, they're saying, "Oh no, we're still not out of this crisis. We'll just focus on the crisis. We'll be back at you, once economy's recovering with the post-COVID economy." But I think the Liberals felt that they needed to present something that was much broader, and I think politics probably played into that.
It's always so good to talk to you. Thank you so much, Kevin.
It's an honor, Senator.
Thank you for seen this from the inside, and I guess it's not always pleasant watching the sausage get made, but it makes you smarter.
Well, it's just good to be with you.
That's great. Kevin Page, he's head of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, a think tank at the University of Ottawa. He was Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer from 2008 to 2013, and he did that work and that research that is so valuable in making the right decisions. Talk to you soon. Be well.
You too, Senator.